and Izzy. So, in the 1960s, it was right off the heels of the baby boom, so there were many young people in the US, and that means that there was just a lot of new ideas and youth to spread ideas that were against the current norms. So, college and university enrollments quadrupled. That's very important for a lot of the reform movements of the time, as they were developed mainly at college campuses and were propagated by those young individuals. Also, these individuals were influenced by the civil rights movements that had been happening either during their early childhood, or just like in their teenage years, and that greatly influenced them and made them more questionable of current standards. Also, they didn't live through World War II or the Great Depression, so they lived in a time where the expression of new ideas was very common. There wasn't like a big conflict facing the U.S. at the time, so there was just time for people to think about how they could change the current standards. And as you can see from the population pyramids, in the 60s, the population that was younger was much greater than it is today, where it's pretty much standard all the way throughout. So, in the 60s, counterculture was a major part of youth culture. First off, most of it was anti-establishment, where they were contesting current gender norms and contesting the Vietnam War. That was a major part of youth culture, was going against the current propagation of the Vietnam War by the government without what they think was the consent of the people. And also, civil rights movements were very important. The ending of systemic racism in the U.S., or trying to combat systemic racism. Same thing with gender norms, combating the way women were viewed in society, and getting rid of some of those systemic issues in America. Also, many of these people who were involved in counterculture were middle-class youth in their 20s. We see the Youth International Party, as well as the Students for Democratic Society, which is the SDS, and the National Organization for Women. As you saw on the previous slide, that most of these people were college students who had the opportunity to develop new ideas and to question society as a result of their place in society. So, as we can see here, this is the Youth International Party's manifesto, the Yippies, and there's just some quotes on the side. They are very anti-establishment. They're saying that they will build and defend a new nation. They will be together with all of the people of the earth. They are looking for a very utopian society, and that's what a lot of the more radical and counterculture movements were about, kind of a more utopian society where everyone was kind to everyone else, and there was like no more oppression, which was very broad and very appealing to a lot of people, but a lot of the movements didn't have a lot of actual traction in like political spheres. So on to the sexual revolution. The 60s involved a lot of changing on the attitudes towards sex. It was the first time that sex was really talked about on a mainstream level. There was an increase in sexual education. So before this time, it was very kind of taboo to even speak about sex. If like you're a parent talking to your kid, that wasn't a normal thing. And so with this time period, people were being educated about sex, and they were then going off and having a lot of sex, which was a massive part about the 60s. Also, contraception played a big part in the increased sexual activity of the time period, as it allowed women to have sex without the need to worry about becoming pregnant and needing to get an abortion, which was currently illegal at the time. Also, homosexual activity was actually viewed more in the public eye instead of being something that was repressed. There were a lot of movements that worked for rights for people that weren't conforming to the main standards of what sexuality was in America. And also, as a result of these changes in sexual identity and like the way it was viewed, women's rights were both increased and also very much suppressed, as they were used for in a lot more exploitative ways, and where the rise in rape increased a lot because of contraception. So, on to drugs.
I'm just gonna talk into this. So during the 60s, there was something called the psychedelic era, which was essentially influenced by a lot of people taking a lot of LSD and other psychedelics. And it influenced a lot of societal changes, like with music and artistic changes. And there was one group that came about in San Francisco called the Merry Pranksters, which was a group of friends that developed around this novelist named Ken Kesey. And they went around they went around the U.S. in this school bus that they had painted, and they distributed LSD. And they were actually accompanied by the Hells Angels as well. And they just went around taking LSD, distributing it. They invited a whole bunch of bands with them. It was kind of like a huge party, but with LSD. It was great. Another thing that happened was the Summer of Love, which was this phenomenon where a whole bunch of young people converged in San Francisco, and they had parties in the street. They had a whole bunch of music festivals. They took a lot of LSD. And there was a phrase called tune in, turn on, and drop out, which promoted taking drugs to like detach yourself from society and embrace like all these cultural changes that are going on in the US. And it promoted a lot of LSD and a whole bunch of like, they called it psychedelic culture, which influenced like music and literature and film. And it was just kind of like a huge party in LA, in San Francisco. The Vietnam War protests were a whole bunch of young people who were about to get drafted for the war, which they didn't want, so they protested against U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War, and they challenged the norm, which was that every effort had been made to stop the spread of global communism. They didn't think that the U.S. needed to get involved in something that they thought was like none of their business. And so the Students for a Democratic Society was an organization that was founded on a college campus, and it was, I think it was the largest, or not the largest, they created the largest like protest at the time in Washington, D.C., which is the March Against the Vietnam War. And they drafted the Port Huron Statement, which stressed participatory democracy and direct government action against the Vietnam War. The Kent State Massacre was during a student protest against the invasion of Cambodia. Currently, the Cambodian civil war was happening at the same time as the Vietnam War, and the U.S. got directly involved in Cambodian affairs in order to counterattack the Viet Cong or something. And so the students were protesting against U.S. involvement, and it was mostly a peaceful protest. There was some looting and vandalism that happened, and so the National Guard was sent to keep the peace between the students. And no one really knows what started it, but the National Guard started firing on the students, and they killed 4 of them, which you can see in this picture that of symbolic protests that a lot of young people took part in the 60s. And this is because young people were mostly the ones being drafted, and they were the ones that most opposed U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. So Congress made the Draft Card Mutilation Act of 1965, which made it a criminal offense to destroy your draft card. And a Catholic pacifist named David Miller was the first protester to burn his draft card in violation of the Draft Card Mutilation Act. The Chicago 7 were 7 defendants who were charged with conspiracy and intent to incite a riot in the Democratic National Convention of 1968. And basically what happened was there were 8 of them, and they were planning a protest during the DNC in Chicago regarding U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. And the protests started getting really violent, and they started escalating and fighting with the police. And so there were 8 of them, and they got arrested on charges of conspiracy and intent to incite a riot. And one of the 8 was Bobby Seale, who was the Black Panther Party founder, and he was later tried separately, and his trial was declared a mistrial because of several biases of the judge and of the jury. All 7 were acquitted of conspiracy, but most of them were convicted of other charges like crossing state lines to incite a riot or, assault or whatever. But it wasn't televised, but it was talked about a lot in the media, and it was a major political trial for the time.
So one of the biggest things that the 60s youth culture is known for is the Woodstock Music Festival. It kind of encapsulated all of the things about youth culture at that time. It was full of a lot of drugs, a lot of counterculture messages about being anti-Vietnam War, and kind of utopian in the sense that it was free admission and it was It was very peaceful, the event itself. Whereas a lot of if you were to get 500,000 people in one place now or at any time in history, that would turn south at some point. But it was incredibly peaceful. A lot of drugs, a lot of sex, a lot of Vietnam War and anti-Vietnam War messages, and so that's why it's kind of known as as like a symbol of the times. But it was heavily criticized by much of the mainstream media during the preparation and the performance of the concert due to lots of logistical mishaps. It actually wasn't supposed to be free, but just because of the amount of people that showed up, they couldn't control the flow of people at all. So it was heavily criticized, but it turned out to be just like a great example of the time period.
And these are our citations.